Jake Harrison sat at the poker table with beings that could have stepped out of humanity's worst nightmares. The Zephyrian across from him had skin like broken glass and eyes that glowed with inner fire. To his left, a Nethan floated in a containment suit filled with purple gas, its tentacles dancing with bioluminescent patterns that hurt to look at directly. The Corvani representative didn't even have a physical form, just a shimmering mass of psychic energy that whispered directly into everyone's minds, but Jake had seen worse things in the war zones of the Outer Rim. He took a slow sip from his flask and studied his cards with the same calm expression he'd worn while disarming antimatter bombs. The tournament had been going on for 3 days now. Species from across the galaxy had gathered on Nexus Prime, a neutral trading station that served as a meeting ground for civilizations that might otherwise shoot each other on sight. The games ranged from simple probability tests to complex multidimensional chess, variants that required thinking in 17 different directions at once. Jake had won more rounds than anyone expected. Humans were new to the galactic scene. Barely 50 years since first contact, and most species still saw them as primitive upstarts. But Jake had something that gave him an edge in every game, the ability to read people. It didn't matter if they had faces made of crystal or communicated through smell. Fear, greed, desperation, and pride looked the same across every species he'd encountered. The current round was elimination style. Only 5 players remained from the original 47 contestants. Jake had outlasted beings with mental abilities that could predict probability curves, species that could process information faster than quantum computers, and creatures that had been gambling since before Earth's sun was born. The human continues to surprise, the Corvani whispered into his mind, its voice like ice sliding down his spine. Perhaps there is more to your species than we initially calculated. Jake didn't respond. He'd learned early that the best way to handle telepaths was to think about something boring. Right now he was mentally reviewing the maintenance schedule for his ship's waste recycling system. It was amazingly effective at keeping psychic snoops out of his head. The Zephyrian dealer began shuffling, a deck of cards that existed in 4 dimensions simultaneously. Each card showed different symbols depending on which angle you viewed it from, and the rules changed based on quantum probability fluctuations. Jake had figured out the pattern after watching 3 rounds. It wasn't about the cards themselves, but about reading the micro-expressions of the dealer's crystalline features. I propose we make this final round more interesting, said a new voice. Everyone at the table turned to look at the newcomer. Vexthal the Void-Touched had been watching the tournament from the shadows, but now it stepped forward into the light. The creature was ancient beyond measure, its form shifting between solid matter and something that existed in the spaces between atoms. When it spoke, reality itself seemed to listen. The current stakes are insufficient for beings of our caliber, Vexthal continued. I propose a different kind of wager. One that will truly test the limits of courage and skill. The Zephyrian's glass-like skin brightened with interest. What manner of challenge do you suggest, Ancient One? Vexthal gestured toward the massive viewing screen that dominated one wall of the gambling hall. The image shifted to show a region of space that made Jake's skin crawl just looking at it. The shattered nebula was a wound in reality itself, a place where several star systems had been destroyed so completely that space-time still hadn't healed properly. In the heart of the shattered nebula lies the tomb world of Kethmorin, Vexthal said. There rests the corpse of a god entity that once commanded the power to unmake entire civilizations with a thought. For millennia, beings have attempted to reach the tomb and claim proof of the god's death. None have returned. The Nethan's tentacles flickered with nervous patterns. 47 challengers have attempted this task over the ages. The tomb is protected by guardians that exist partially outside normal space-time. The journey itself is lethal to most forms of life, which is precisely why it makes for such an excellent wager, Vexthal replied. The challenge is simple. Travel to Kethmorin, enter the god's tomb, and return with proof of its death. The first to accomplish this task wins not only the current pot, but a fortune in galactic currency and the respect of every species represented here. Jake looked at the swirling chaos of the shattered nebula and felt something stir in his chest. It wasn't fear exactly, though any sane person would be terrified. It was the same feeling he'd had before every impossible mission he'd survived. The quiet certainty that someone had to do it, and it might as well be him. What constitutes proof? He asked. Vexthal's form solidified slightly, becoming more substantial. A fragment of the god's skull would suffice. The bone is harder than diamond and infused with energies that cannot be replicated. There would be no doubt of its authenticity. The Kovani's psychic voice carried undertones of concern. The human asks practical questions. This suggests he is seriously considering the challenge. I must advise against such folly. The tomb's guardians are not merely physical threats. They attack the mind itself, attempting to drive intruders insane before destroying them. Jake finished his drink and stood up. I'll need to see my ship and check on my crew. When do we leave? The silence that followed was so complete that Jake could hear the station's life support systems humming in the background. Every being in the gambling hall was staring at him with expressions that ranged from disbelief to something approaching. Respect. You cannot be serious, the Zephyrian said finally. The tomb has claimed beings far more powerful than any human. Your species has barely begun to explore beyond your own solar system. That's exactly why I'm going, Jake replied. Everyone else here is thinking about this like a problem to be solved with advanced technology or psychic powers. But sometimes, the best way to deal with an impossible situation is to be too stupid to know it's impossible. Vexthal's ancient eyes seemed to gleam with something that might have been amusement. Very well, human. You have one standard galactic cycle to complete the challenge. Your ship and crew are your own responsibility. If you fail to return, the wager defaults to the remaining contestants. Jake nodded and headed for the exit. Behind him, he could hear the other species discussing the human's obvious death wish in several different languages. He didn't care. He'd made worse bets with longer odds, and he was still here. The Defiant was docked in the station's military section. A sleek destroyer that had been his home for the past 5 years. His crew was small but skilled. Casey Mitchell, an engineer who could make miracles happen with spare parts and determination. Alex Turner, a demolitions expert who stayed calm under pressure. And Lisa Grant, a scientist who understood alien biology better than most aliens understood themselves. They were playing cards in the ship's mess hall when Jake walked in. Casey looked up from her hand and immediately read his expression. Let me guess, she said. You found a way to make this shore leave more dangerous than our last combat mission. Jake smiled and began explaining about ancient gods and impossible tombs. His crew listened without interrupting, asking practical questions about equipment and timeline. They didn't question his decision to accept the challenge. They'd followed him through enough impossible situations to trust his judgment. By the time he finished briefing them, they were already planning their approach to the shattered nebula. It was going to be the most dangerous mission any of them had ever attempted. But that was just another day in the life of a human crew that specialized in doing things that couldn't be done. Jake looked out at the stars through the mess hall viewport and felt that familiar stirring in his chest. Somewhere out there, an alien god lay dead in a tomb that had claimed 47 lives. Soon, it would be 48, or humanity would have a new trophy to add to their collection of impossible victories. Either way, it was going to be interesting. The Defiant left Nexus Prime with enough supplies to last 2 weeks and weapons capable of destroying a small moon. Jake watched the station shrink behind them as Casey pushed the engines to maximum burn. They had exactly 26 days to reach the shattered nebula, find the tomb world, and return with proof of a dead god. The first 3 days of travel were routine. Space looked normal, the stars were where they belonged, and the ship's systems hummed with reliable efficiency. Jake used the time to study everything they knew about Kethmoran and the shattered nebula. The information was sparse and mostly consisted of warnings about why nobody should go there. The god had died during something called the Entropy Wars, a conflict so ancient that most species had forgotten it ever happened. According to the few records that survived, Kethmorin had been a being of pure destruction, capable of unmaking matter with a thought. Its death had been violent enough to shatter the fabric of space-time itself, creating the unstable region. They were now approaching. Lisa spent her time analyzing the biological data they had on the tomb's guardians. The creatures were described as former challengers who had been transformed by exposure to the god's residual energy. They retained their intelligence but lost their free will, becoming eternal protectors of their master's corpse. The transformation seems to enhance their physical capabilities while maintaining their species-specific advantages, Lisa explained during their morning briefing. A Kovani guardian would still have psychic abilities, but amplified beyond normal limits. A Zephyrian would become even more resilient and faster. Alex was more interested in the practical aspects of the challenge. 47 beings have tried this over the centuries. That means we're potentially facing 47 different types of enhanced guardians, each one designed to kill intruders in the most efficient way possible. Good thing we brought enough explosives to level a city, Casey said from the pilot's seat. Though I'm more worried about the nebula itself. The sensor readings I'm getting are completely insane. Jake moved to the navigation console and looked at the readings. The shattered nebula appeared on their screens as a massive cloud of crimson gas that seemed to writhe and pulse with its own internal rhythm. Energy readings fluctuated wildly, showing power levels that should have been impossible in empty space. We're still 2 days out and the instruments are already going crazy, Casey continued. Once we're inside that thing, we'll be flying blind most of the time. The first real indication that they were entering dangerous territory came when their chronometer started running backward. Jake noticed it during his evening weapon maintenance routine. The ship's clock showed that they had somehow lost 3 hours, even though everyone remembered experiencing the full day. Time dilation, Lisa said when he brought it to her attention. The nebula's gravitational anomalies are affecting the flow of time around us. We might experience days while only hours pass in normal space, or the reverse. The effect worsened as they penetrated deeper into the nebula. The crimson clouds outside began to take on shapes that looked almost deliberate, as if the gas itself was trying to form patterns or symbols. Jake found himself staring at the view screen more than he should, trying to decipher meaning from the swirling chaos. Don't look at it too long, Alex warned. I've been watching the patterns for the past hour and I'm starting to see faces in the clouds. Pretty sure that's not a good sign. Casey had rerouted power through backup systems when the main engines began stuttering. The nebula's energy fields were interfering with their reactor core, causing fluctuations that made normal space travel impossible. She worked with steady concentration, her hands dancing over control panels as she coaxed their ship deeper into the cosmic anomaly. The attack started on their 5th day in the nebula. Jake was reviewing star charts when every alarm on the ship started screaming at once. The tactical display showed something massive approaching from their starboard side, but the sensors couldn't get a clear reading on what it was. It's big, Alex reported from the weapons console. Maybe the size of a battleship, but the energy signature is completely alien. It's not showing up on any of our threat databases. Jake ordered battle stations and moved to the command chair. Through the view screen, he could see something taking shape in the crimson clouds. It looked like a creature made of living shadow and starlight, its form shifting between solid matter and pure energy. When it opened what might have been a mouth, Jake felt a pressure in his mind that made his teeth ache. The attack wasn't physical. The creature reached out with tendrils of psychic energy, trying to invade their thoughts and crush their sanity. Under visions of cosmic horror, Jake felt images flooding his mind: the heat death of the universe, the meaninglessness of existence, the inevitable decay of all things. But Jake had seen real horror during the border wars. He'd watched friends die in ways that would give nightmares to seasoned soldiers. He'd stood in the ruins of colonies that had been glassed from orbit and helped pull survivors from the wreckage. The creature's visions of cosmic despair were terrible, but they were abstract. Jake had lived through concrete horrors that were far more personal. Casey screamed from the pilot's seat, her hands locked on the controls as the creature's psychic assault overwhelmed her. Lisa collapsed at her station, her body convulsing as alien thoughts invaded her mind. Alex was still functional, but barely, his face pale with strain as he fought to maintain focus. Jake realized that the creature was trying to break them the way it had broken other species. It was showing them the ultimate futility of existence, the pointlessness of struggle against entropy. But humans had grown up knowing they were going to die. Every human child learned that the universe was vast and uncaring, that individual lives were brief sparks in an endless darkness. The creature's attack was devastating to species that believed in cosmic purpose or divine protection. But humans had built their entire civilization on the assumption that existence was meaningless, and they had to create their own meaning through action and choice. Jake stood up from his command chair and walked to the weapons console. Alex was barely conscious, his finger hovering over the firing controls. Jake placed his hand over his friend's and helped him squeeze the trigger. The ship's main guns fired concentrated bursts of plasma directly into the creature's core. The being shrieked across multiple dimensions, its form wavering as human weapons tore through its essence. It wasn't built to handle opposition from creatures that had already accepted their own mortality. The psychic assault cut off abruptly. Casey gasped and regained control of the ship, while Lisa slowly pulled herself back to her feet. Alex shook his head to clear it and checked the tactical display. "It's retreating," he reported. "Whatever that thing was, it didn't expect us to fight back." Jake helped Lisa to her chair and made sure she was steady. "You okay, Doc?" "I think so," she said, though her hands were still shaking. "That thing was trying to show us visions of universal entropy. It was designed to break species that believe in cosmic order or divine purpose. Good thing we don't believe in either," Casey said from the pilot's seat. "Humans figured out a long time ago that the universe doesn't care about us. We're still here anyway." The rest of their journey through the nebula was harrowing but manageable. They encountered 2 more guardian creatures, each one using different methods to try to drive them insane or turn them back. But every attack was based on the assumption that the intruders would be afraid of death, meaninglessness, or cosmic horror. Humans had made peace with all 3 concepts before they ever left their home planet. On the 8th day, the tomb world of Kethmoran materialized from the crimson fog ahead of them. The planet's surface was a maze of crystalline spires and impossible geometries that hurt to look at directly. At its center stood a single massive structure that could only be the god's tomb. Jake looked at his crew and saw determination in their faces. They had come further than any of the previous 47 challengers. Now came the real test. "Take us down, Casey," he ordered. "Let's go meet a dead god." The planet Kethmoran was wrong in ways that made Jake's eyes hurt to look at it. The surface existed in multiple dimensions at once, creating visual effects that his brain couldn't properly process. Buildings twisted in directions that shouldn't exist, and the horizon curved upward in places where it should have been flat. The tomb itself dominated the landscape like a cancer, its walls pulsing with sickly bioluminescent light. Casey brought the Defiant down in a clearing of black glass that had been fused by energies older than most star systems. The landing was rough because the ship's instruments couldn't agree on which direction was down. Gravity flowed in streams across the planet's surface, creating pockets where a person could fall upward or sideways without warning. "Atmosphere is breathable, but I wouldn't recommend it," Lisa reported from her science station. "The air contains trace amounts of exotic particles that could cause cellular damage over extended exposure. We'll need full environmental suits." Jake suited up with practiced efficiency, checking his equipment one final time before they left the ship. His gear included experimental human technology that had been designed specifically for this mission. The phase shift generator would allow him to partially exist in multiple dimensions, hopefully protecting him from the worst of the planet's reality warping effects. The quantum communicator would keep them in contact even if spacetime decided to fold itself into origami. Alex loaded his weapons with ammunition that had been blessed by physicists and cursed by engineers. The rounds contained compressed packets of organized chaos designed to disrupt any form of matter or energy they encountered. He also carried enough explosive charges to level a small city, though he wasn't sure conventional explosives would work against entities that existed partially. Outside normal reality, Casey stayed with the ship to monitor their progress and maintain their escape route. She had rigged the Defiance engines to function on backup power in case the planet's energy fields interfered with their primary systems. Her job was to make sure they had a ride home when the mission was complete. The walk to the tomb took 3 hours across terrain that shifted and changed with each step. Jake's boots left prints in sand that turned to crystal before melting into liquid metal. The sky above them was the color of dried blood, and twin suns cast shadows that fell in every direction except where they should have been. Lisa documented everything with scientific precision, her instruments recording energy readings that defied classification. "The quantum signature is unlike anything in our databases," she reported through the CUM system. "It's as if the planet exists in a state of controlled decay held together by will alone." The tomb's entrance was a wound in reality itself, a gaping opening that seemed to swallow light and sound. Ancient symbols covered the walls around the doorway, shifting and changing when observed directly. Jake couldn't read them, but he got the distinct impression they were warnings written in a language that predated most galactic civilizations. They descended into the tomb with military precision, Jake taking point while Alex covered their rear. The corridors were wide enough for a small army, with walls that told the story of Kethmoran's reign through carved reliefs that moved when nobody was looking directly at them. The god had been a creature of pure entropy, capable of unmaking star systems with a thought. The first chamber they entered contained the calcified remains of the god's servants. The beings had been turned to stone during their master's death throes, their faces frozen in expressions of eternal agony. Some were species that Jake recognized from the galactic databases, while others were completely alien forms that might have gone extinct millennia ago. "These weren't killed by the god's enemies," Lisa observed as she examined one of the stone figures. "They were transformed by exposure to Kethmoran's death energy. The process appears to have been instantaneous, but incredibly painful." Deeper into the tomb, they found evidence of the previous challengers who had attempted to reach the god's resting place. 47 beings from across the galaxy had made it this far over the centuries, but none had managed to complete their mission. Their remains were scattered throughout the corridors, some reduced to dust while others had been preserved in crystalline cocoons. "Look at this," Alex called from beside a wall covered in scratches and burn marks. "Somebody put up a hell of a fight here." "These scorch marks are from military-grade plasma weapons." Jake examined the battle damage and felt a chill run down his spine. Whatever had killed these challengers had been powerful enough to shrug off. Weapons that could punch through battleship armor. The scratches in the walls looked like claw marks, but they were too large and too deep to have been made by any natural creature. They continued deeper into the tomb, past chambers filled with artifacts that hurt to look at directly. The god had collected trophies from its conquests, entire planets compressed into crystalline spheres, the preserved corpses of heroes who had tried to stop its rampage, weapons that had been designed to kill gods and failed in their purpose. The walls around them pulsed with that same sickly light, and Jake began to notice that the pattern wasn't random. The tomb itself was alive in some way, its heartbeat synchronized with the quantum fluctuations that Lisa's instruments were detecting. They weren't just walking through a building. They were moving through the corpse of something vast and alien. "The energy readings are getting stronger," Lisa reported. "We're approaching something that contains massive amounts of stored power. If I didn't know better, I'd say we're walking toward a nuclear reactor." "You do know better," Jake replied. "We're walking toward a dead god." The corridor ahead of them opened into a vast chamber that made Jake's breath catch in his throat. The room was the size of a cathedral, its ceiling lost in shadows that seemed to move with their own purpose. At the center of the space, on a raised dais carved from black stone, lay the corpse of Kethmoran. The god was massive beyond comprehension, its body a fusion of organic tissue and crystallized void stuff. Even in death, it radiated power that made their instruments scream warnings. The god's skull was the size of a small building, its bone harder than diamond and darker than the space between stars. Ancient runes covered its surface, shifting and changing in patterns that suggested they were still trying to cast spells, but Jake's attention was immediately drawn to the figures that stood guard around the dais. The previous challengers hadn't died in the tomb's corridors. They had been transformed into eternal guardians, their bodies twisted into forms that maximized their ability to kill intruders. 47 beings from across the galaxy now served their dead master, their minds enslaved to protect what they had once sought to claim. The guardians moved with inhuman grace as they detected the intruders, a Corvani that had been transformed into living psychic energy, began generating mental attacks that felt like ice picks in Jake's brain. A Zephyrian's crystalline body had been enhanced with razor-sharp edges that could cut through molecular bonds. A Nephin floated in a cloud of poisonous gas that would dissolve any organic matter it touched. "So much for the easy approach, Alex," muttered as he raised his weapon. "Any bright ideas, boss?" Jake looked at the army of transformed guardians and felt that familiar calm settle over him. These creatures had once been living beings with hopes and dreams and fears. Now they were just obstacles between him and his objective. He'd faced worse odds during the border wars, though admittedly those enemies had been more conventionally alive. "We do what humans do best," he said, checking the charge on his plasma rifle. "We break things that need to be broken." The battle that followed was fierce but brief. Human military doctrine had been refined through centuries of warfare against enemies that were faster, stronger, and more numerous than individual humans. The key was to use superior tactics and overwhelming firepower to even the odds. Alex's explosive charges created chaos among the Guardians, disrupting their coordinated attacks and forcing them to fight as individuals rather than as a unified force. Jake's phase shift generator allowed him to partially exist in multiple dimensions, making him difficult for the Guardians to target effectively. Lisa provided tactical support, analyzing the Guardians' attack patterns and identifying weak points. In their enhanced biology, the transformed beings fought with desperate fury, but they were constrained by their original species' limitations. The Corvani Guardians' psychic attacks were powerful but predictable. The Zephyrian's crystalline body was tough but brittle. The Nithin's poison cloud was lethal but slow-moving. Humans had learned to adapt to any enemy they encountered. These Guardians were just another problem to be solved with applied violence and creative thinking. When the last Guardian fell, Jake approached the god's skull with reverence and determination. The bone was warm to the touch and hummed with residual power that made his teeth ache. Using Alex's specialized cutting tools, they began the delicate process of removing a section large enough to serve as proof of their accomplishment. But as the first cut was made, something impossible happened. The god's eyes opened, and Jake realized that their real test was just beginning. The god's eyes were like looking into the heart of dying stars. Kethmoran wasn't dead, Jake realized with growing horror. The ancient entity had been dreaming for millennia, and its dreams were slowly remaking reality around them. The tomb began to shift and change, walls flowing like liquid as the god's subconscious mind stirred from its long slumber. "The energy readings just spiked beyond measurement," Lisa reported, her voice tight with fear. "Whatever we did to wake it up, the quantum effects are spreading throughout the entire structure." Jake kept the cutting tool steady against the god's skull even as the floor beneath his feet rippled like water. "How long do we have?" "At this rate of expansion, maybe 10 minutes before the reality distortions reach critical mass," Lisa said. "After that, the laws of physics in this area might stop working entirely." Alex planted explosive charges around the chamber's entrance while trying to maintain his balance on a floor that couldn't decide if it wanted to be solid. "I hate to be the one to point this out, but if this thing is waking up, maybe we should be running instead of trying to carve souvenirs from its head." The god's voice was the sound of galaxies dying, a whisper that reverberated through their bones and made their equipment scream warnings. When it spoke, reality hiccuped around them, creating pockets where cause and effect flowed backward. "Mortals," Kethmoran said, its words carrying the weight of cosmic authority. You have served your purpose. Through your will and determination, you have provided the catalyst needed to bridge the gap between dream and wakefulness. Jake felt understanding crash over him like a cold wave. This had been the trap all along. Vexthal hadn't sent them here to retrieve a trophy. The ancient entity had sent them to be the key that would unlock a cosmic horror upon the galaxy. The god needed something with sufficient will and determination to anchor its consciousness to reality, and humans were apparently stubborn enough to serve that purpose. You're trying to use us as some kind of psychic battery, Jake said, continuing to work at the skull with his cutting tool. You need our mental energy to fully wake up. Your species possesses a unique quality, the god replied, its form beginning to solidify as its consciousness grew stronger. Other beings accept their limitations, acknowledge the supremacy of entropy. But humans rage against the dying of the light, fighting impossible odds simply because surrender is unthinkable. The chamber around them continued to warp and change. Gravity flowed in streams, creating whirlpools where debris orbited in tight circles before being flung against the walls. Time moved in spirals, causing their movements to echo across multiple moments simultaneously. Jake could see ghostly images of himself from several seconds ago and several seconds in the future, all trying to complete the same task. I offer you power beyond your comprehension, Kethmorin continued. Stand beside me as reality is unmade and remade according to ancient design. Watch as I bring perfect entropy to a universe that has forgotten the beauty of ending. Jake's response was uniquely human. He looked up from his work and met the god's cosmic gaze with complete calm. Go to hell. The battle that followed wasn't physical. It was a contest of wills, a struggle between the god's desire to return to full consciousness and Jake's stubborn refusal to be anyone's cosmic key. Kethmorin reached out with tendrils of pure thought, trying to dominate his mind and force him to surrender his will. But Jake had been refusing to surrender for his entire military career. He'd held impossible positions against overwhelming odds, led desperate charges when retreat would have been sensible, and somehow managed to bring most of his people home alive. The god's mental assault was just another enemy trying to break his determination. Casey's voice crackled through the comm system from the ship. Jake, whatever you're doing in there, the entire planet is starting to destabilize. The quantum readings are going completely insane. Keep the engines warm, Jake replied without taking his attention away from the cutting tool. We might need to leave in a hurry. Alex worked frantically to set up a defensive perimeter while reality twisted around them. His explosive charges weren't designed to damage a god, but they might buy them a few precious seconds if the situation got worse. Boss, I don't think conventional weapons are going to be much help here. Lisa had given up trying to get coherent readings from her instruments. Instead, she was using her knowledge of xenobiology to analyze the god's physiology. The entity's consciousness is distributed throughout its entire body. Even if we could damage the skull, it wouldn't necessarily kill or disable it. The god's assault intensified, flooding Jake's mind with visions of cosmic horror and universal decay. He saw stars dying in accelerated time, civilizations crumbling to dust, the heat death of the universe arriving billions of years early. Kethmorin showed him the futility of existence, the pointlessness of struggle against entropy, but Jake had seen real horror during the border wars. He'd watched friends die in ways that would give nightmares to hardened soldiers. He'd stood in the ruins of colonies that had been destroyed and helped pull survivors from the wreckage. The god's abstract visions of cosmic despair were terrible, but they lacked the personal weight of concrete loss. More importantly, Jake understood something that cosmic entities often missed. Humans had built their entire civilization on the assumption that existence was meaningless and they had to create their own purpose through action and choice. The god's revelation that the universe would eventually end wasn't devastating news to a species that had already accepted mortality as the price of consciousness. While Kethmorin focused on trying to break his will through cosmic horror, Jake did something the god hadn't expected. He began to impose his own vision of reality onto the chamber around them. Human stubbornness was more than just mental resistance. It was an active force that refused to accept limitations, the tomb filled with impossibilities that followed human logic rather than cosmic order. Gravity flowed upward because Jake decided it should. Time moved sideways because that was more convenient for his current task. Space folded itself into shapes that made tactical sense rather than mathematical sense. "What are you doing?" the god demanded, its voice carrying undertones of confusion and growing alarm. "I'm being human," Jake replied, finally managing to cut through a section of the skull. The fragment came away in his hands, warm and humming with residual power. "We're really good at ignoring rules that don't work for us." The god's certainty began to waver as human chaos infected its perfect order. Kethmorin had spent millennia dreaming of entropy and decay, building a consciousness based on the ultimate victory of disorder over structure. But humans had turned chaos into a tool, using randomness and unpredictability as weapons against enemies that relied on predictable patterns. "You cannot defy the natural order," the god protested, its form beginning to flicker as its grip on reality loosened. "Entropy is the ultimate law of existence." "Maybe," Jake said, securing the skull fragment in a containment field. "But we've got more important things to do than worry about cosmic laws." "Alex, how are those charges coming?" "Ready to blow on your signal," Alex reported. "Though I should mention that the structural integrity of this place is already compromised. We might not need explosives to bring it down." The god made one final attempt to dominate Jake's will, pouring all of its cosmic power into a psychic assault that should have crushed any mortal mind. But Jake had something that Kethmorin couldn't understand or overcome, the absolute certainty that someone had to complete the mission, and it might as well be him. The god's attack broke against human determination like waves against a seawall. Kethmorin retreated back into its death-like slumber, but not before Jake caught a glimpse of something in its ancient eyes that might have been respect. "Time to go," Jake announced, hefting the skull fragment. "We got what we came for." The tomb was collapsing around them as they ran for the exit, reality reasserting itself now that the god had returned to dormancy. Behind them, the chamber filled with the sound of cosmic forces returning to their proper dimensions, creating a cacophony that followed them all the way back to the surface. Casey had the Defiance engines running when they reached the landing site. The planet was still unstable, with gravitational anomalies creating visible distortions in the air above them. They needed to get off-world before the quantum effects reached critical mass. As they lifted off from Kethmorin, Jake looked back at the tomb and felt a mixture of satisfaction and unease. They had accomplished the impossible, but he couldn't shake the feeling that they had also dodged something far worse than death. The god had been looking for a way back to consciousness, and humanity had almost provided it, but almost only counted in horseshoes and nuclear weapons. They had the skull fragment, proof that even cosmic entities could be faced down by beings who refused to accept defeat. Now they just had to make it home. The journey back through the shattered nebula was a nightmare of failing systems and impossible physics. The Defiant limped through space with half her engines offline and her hull plating scarred by exposure to reality-warping energies. Casey worked miracles at the engineering station, routing power through backup systems that had never been designed to handle the load. "Main reactor is running at 40% efficiency," she reported, sweat beading on her forehead as she juggled power distribution between life support and propulsion. "The quantum effects from that tomb did something to our antimatter containment system. I can keep us moving, but we're burning through fuel reserves at twice the normal rate." Jake secured the skull fragment in the ship's most heavily shielded storage compartment. Even through multiple layers of containment fields, the thing hummed with residual energy that made their instruments go haywire. The bone was warm to the touch and seemed to pulse with its own internal rhythm, as if some part of Kethmorin-esque consciousness was still trapped within it. "How long until we clear the nebula?" Jake asked, taking his place at the command station. "At our current speed, maybe 6 days," Casey replied. "Assuming nothing else tries to kill us and the engines don't explode." Alex monitored their tactical systems while keeping watch for more Guardian creatures. The weapons were functioning, but their targeting computers couldn't get reliable locks on anything in the nebula's chaotic environment. We've got movement on the sensors, but I can't tell if it's more Guardians or just the nebula playing tricks. On us, Lisa analyzed the energy readings from the skull fragment, documenting everything for the report she would have to write when they returned to human space. The quantum signature is unlike anything in our databases. This fragment contains compressed information about the fundamental structure of reality itself. It's going to take years for our scientists to fully understand what we've recovered. The first major crisis came on their second day out from Kethmoran. The ship's navigation system suffered a complete failure when they encountered a region where spacetime had been folded into impossible configurations. Their instruments insisted they were moving in 17 different directions simultaneously while also remaining perfectly stationary. Casey solved the problem by switching to manual navigation and flying by intuition rather than sensor readings. I'm following the energy gradients back toward normal space, she explained as she piloted them through a maze of twisted dimensions. The nebula has a flow pattern like a river current. If we follow it downstream, it should carry us out. The approach worked, but it cost them precious time and fuel. They were now operating on emergency reserves with 4 days still to go before reaching the nebula's edge. Jake made the decision to reduce life support to minimal levels and reroute. The saved power to the engines. We'll be breathing recycled air for the next few days, he announced to the crew. But we'll get home faster. On the third day, they encountered another Guardian creature, this one larger and more aggressive than the previous entities. It appeared without warning, materializing from the crimson fog like a living nightmare. The creature was roughly humanoid in shape but composed entirely of crystallized void stuff, its form crackling with energies that predated the formation of most galaxies. It's trying to board us, Alex reported as the creature slammed into their hull with enough force to buckle the outer plating. Hull breach in Section 7? Emergency containment fields are holding, but barely. Jake made a command decision. That would have horrified any sane starship captain. Casey, ram it, sir, you heard me? Full power to forward shields and ram that thing head-on. We're not playing defense anymore. The Defiance engines roared to life as Casey pushed them far beyond their safety limits. The ship accelerated directly toward the Guardian creature, which seemed genuinely surprised by the aggressive response. Most species would have tried to flee or defend against such an entity. Humans apparently preferred to meet cosmic horror. With applied violence, the collision was spectacular. The Guardian creature was tough enough to survive the initial impact, but it wasn't prepared for the follow-up assault. Alex had rigged the ship's forward weapon arrays to overload on impact, creating a controlled explosion that would have destroyed most vessels. The Defiant's reinforced hull and emergency shields allowed them to survive the blast that vaporized their attacker. Damage report, Jake called as the ship shook itself apart around them. We're alive, Casey reported, which seemed to be the best news she could offer. But we just burned out half our remaining systems. Navigation is offline, artificial gravity is flickering, and I think we lost the coffee maker. The coffee maker is the real tragedy, Alex said, checking his weapon status. But the good news is that nothing else seems eager to mess with us after that display. The final 2 days of their journey were a testament to human ingenuity and stubbornness. With most of their advanced systems offline, they had to rely on backup equipment that had been designed for emergencies. Casey piloted the ship using manual controls and visual navigation. Following the stars like ancient mariners crossing an ocean. Lisa monitored the skull fragment, which seemed to be growing more active as they approached normal space. The energy output is increasing exponentially. It's almost as if the fragment is trying to communicate with something outside the nebula. Let me guess, Jake said. It's calling home to tell its friends about the annoying humans who stole a piece of their God. That's actually not far from the truth. The quantum resonance patterns suggest it's attempting to establish some kind of connection with similar energy signatures in normal space. Jake made another command decision. Dump it into an isolation chamber and cut all power to that section of the ship. If that thing wants to make phone calls, it can do it on someone else's time. The isolation worked, though it cost them their last backup power system. They were now running on emergency batteries and whatever energy Casey could coax from the dying reactor core. But they were close now, so close that Jake could see the nebula's edge on their forward screen. When the Defiant finally emerged from the shattered nebula, every system on the ship was either offline or operating far beyond its design specifications. They had no weapons, minimal life support, and engines that were held together by willpower and improvised repairs. But they were alive, and they had accomplished something that 47 other beings had died attempting, the journey back to. Nexus Prime took another week at sublight speed. Jake used the time to prepare his report and plan what he would say. To Vexthal, the ancient entity had tried to use them as unwitting pawns in some cosmic game, but they had turned the tables and claimed victory on their own terms. When they finally docked at Nexus Prime, word of their return spread through the station like wildfire. No one had expected the humans to come back, least of all with proof of their success. The skull fragment was authenticated by the station's most advanced scanning equipment, confirming that it was genuine godbone infused with energies that couldn't be replicated. Jake found Vexthal waiting for him in the same gambling hall where this had all started. The ancient entity examined the skull fragment with something approaching disbelief, its form flickering between dimensions as it processed what the humans had accomplished. You were supposed to fail, Vexthal said finally. The tomb was designed to claim any being that entered it. Keth Morin should have used your life force to fuel its return to consciousness. Yeah, well, things don't always go according to plan, Jake replied, settling into his chair with a glass of bourbon. Turns out humans are too stubborn to make good cosmic keys. The payment ceremony was broadcast throughout the station, with representatives from dozens of species gathering to witness the impossible. Jake accepted his winnings with the same calm expression he'd worn throughout the entire ordeal. The fortune in galactic currency was nice, but the real prize was the look of grudging respect in the eyes of beings who had previously dismissed humanity as primitive upstarts. Casey, Alex, and Lisa were each awarded citations for valor by the Galactic Council, making them the first humans to receive such recognition. The skull fragment was placed in a secured vault pending further study, though Jake suspected it would be decades before anyone fully understood what they had recovered. As Jake stood in the station's observation deck, looking out at the stars, with a fresh glass of bourbon in his hand, he reflected on what they had accomplished. They had traveled to the tomb of a cosmic entity, faced down guardians that had claimed 47 previous challengers, and returned with proof that even gods could be defeated by sufficient human stubbornness. More importantly, they had announced humanity's arrival on the galactic stage in the most human way possible, by doing something that everyone said was impossible, and then having the audacity to succeed. Vexthal approached him as he contemplated the implications of their victory. The ancient entity spoke of other challenges, other impossible tasks that awaited those brave enough to attempt them. But Jake was already thinking about home, about the report he would have to write, about the look on his commanding officer's face when he explained why he had decided to pick a fight with a dead god. The galaxy had seen what one human crew could accomplish.